Hasidus has its own culture. In other words, in addition to the heart of Hasidus, which is what Hasidus teaches and what Hasidus inspires and what Hasidus directs towards, there's also the traditions, the way it looks, the way it feels, the way it's experienced, the way it's viewed. And certainly, Hasidus is quite diverse. There's not one type of Hasidus. There's many different types of Hasidus that are separated in many different ways, not just in what kind of hats people wear, but in their philosophies, the way they understand what the Baal Shem Tov taught. There's all different types of Hasidus. Undoubtedly, Chabad Hasidus is apart. It's different. It's unique. And as a result, the culture of Chabad is also unique. Part of the Chabad culture, certainly in the olden days, I'm not sure how prominent a discussion this is today, but in the traditions of Hasidus Chabad, one of the aspects of the Chabad culture was the struggle, the difference, the issue of what is called the maskil versus the oived. That's Hebrew. In English, that means the philosopher versus the laborer, the worker, the servant of God. Hasidus Chabad has two parts. And because Hasidus Chabad has two parts, it's produced two different types of personality. Hasidus Chabad is a very rich philosophy. It really is a rich philosophy. And rich means it's very interesting and very insightful and enlightening. The right word for learning Hasidus Chabad is enlightening. Enlightening means that when you learn it, it fills your awareness with light, with richness, with beauty. On the other hand, Hasidus Chabad is also a worship. It's a service of God. And of course, as a worship and as a service of God, it involves hard work. And the hard work of the Chassid, the Chabad Chassid, is on himself. It's not about chopping wood or building houses, it's about refining oneself, which is, of course, the most difficult work anybody could do. And the result is that you have two parts of the same movement. One is so incredibly rich and full of light, and the other is like a fullback. It's pushing. It's avoida, incessant avoida. And when you read about Chabad personalities, you hear about even Chabad personalities who lived in our times that we knew, the great Hasidim who survived the war and the Holocaust and came to America. You learn about these different tendencies. Different personalities had different priorities. Some Hasidim were defined by their incredible richness of understanding and experience of the philosophy of Hasidus. And others were defined by their avodah, by their labor, and by their struggle. Of course, ideally, the truth is supposed to be that you're supposed to combine the two. You're supposed to fuse together the labor, the struggle, the avodah of the Chabad Chassid with the richness of the Chabad Hasidus, because the combination makes you a whole person. On the one hand, when you work on yourself, you become a mensch. On the other hand, when you have this richness, you're not a depressed mensch. You're a free mensch. You're a rich mensch. You're a creative mensch. You're an open mensch. I'll just tell you a little comment. There was a very, very, very great chassid whose name was Rabbi Masmit. Rabbi Yitzchak Gorowitz was his family name. He unfortunately was killed by the Nazis in 1942. Who met a chassid younger than he was, who was a very intense Oived, whose whole life was defined by avodah, by work. His name was Nissen Nemenov. Nissen Nemenov was one of those Hasidim who was afraid of the Chabad philosophy. Why? Precisely because it was so beautiful. He had a problem with anything that you enjoy too much. Even if you were enjoying religion, to him there was a problem, because he felt that it takes away from that absolute priority that we would call in the Chabad culture Kabbalah sale, discipline, the service of God. When he would teach Hasidus, he didn't permit himself to enjoy the philosophy, because to him it's all about avodah, about the work. So the Richard the Masmid said to the Nissen, the greater Chaz, said to the Nissen Nemenov, he says, in Kabbalah we learn about the 10 spheres, the 10 attributes. Malchus is only one of the 10 attributes. And Malchus is Kabbalah Sale. The idea of discipline and self-control is only one part of being a person. To be whole, you have to use all of your senses, your mind, your heart, and your powers of behavior and action and discipline and self-control. But this is very much part of the Chabad tradition. In other words, in the inner circle of the Chabad Chassidim, one of the discussions that filled much of the discourse of the last 2 centuries was the question of the philosopher versus the avoid, the laborer. These are very different types of human beings, very different types of people. In other words, why one is drawn to one and the other is drawn to another is not only a choice, it's a tendency, it's a nature. And again, I want to underscore that really you're supposed to combine both. Philosophy without avoida alone is not avoida, it's not Yiddishkeit. Avoida without Chassidus is depressed. It's not alive, it's not enlightened. It's the combination makes a chassid. I just came across, somebody shared with me a commentary that the Rebbe Rashab once made. The Rebbe Rashab, the 5th Lubavitcher Rebbe, once made a comment about a particular thing, and he said, my wagon is tiled with sweat and blood of avodah, and its roof is gilded with the philosophy of Chabad. That's how I put it. The deck of my wagon is the blood and sweat of avodas Hashem, of the labor of serving the Eibishter, and the canopy, the top, is gilded, is decorated with the richness and beauty of Hasidus Chabad. The combination is a special kind of person. A chassid who manages to fuse together the integrity, the emes of avodah, and the richness of the Hasidus of the Haskell of Hasidus Chabad is a very fortunate person. It's a human being who has worked to make himself into a servant to the Eibishter and has achieved something very, very real and something very, very permanent. But in the discussion, when we sit around and you have fabrengens, you have discussions, you shmooze, much of the shmooze that exists in the Chabad culture is the shmooze of the maskil versus the Yovid. Let me be honest with you and tell you that Chabad purists, in other words, those who say the truth, have no patience for the philosophers. They don't like them so much. Even though Chabad Hasidus is a philosophy, but Chabad Hasidus is a religion. And I mean the word religion in the most narrow sense of the word. It's about work. It's about discipline. It's about growth. It's about change. And therefore you can study all the philosophy of Chabad in the world and remain the same person you were before you started. It's not going to touch you. And they would call that a chassid shaita, being a fool. Here you are, you're so informed, you're so enlightened, you know so much about growth and change, and all you're doing is enjoying the philosophy of the growth and the change and not growing and changing at all. I'll tell you something very sharp, terribly sharp. This Rebbe the Masmid, this chassid, Rebbe the Masmid was a very great man. I believe that he was a tzaddik from the Tanya, not a Beini from the Tanya, a tzaddik from the Tanya. He once told the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, there's a group of people called Amalek. Amalek are bad guys. It's like the worst. What is the trademark of Amalek, of the Amalekites? He knows his maker, he understands what God is, and wantonly rebels against God. So the Rebbe the Masmid once said to the Frierdiker Rebbe, who knows God and rebels against God? Only Chasidei Chabad, only us. Why? The rest of the world doesn't know anything about God. We study about God, and then we don't serve God, we're not, instead of Amalek. The previous Rebbe was very, very disturbed by the comment. It really bothered him. He says, I refused to accept it. He felt it was a very negative and it was over-the-top criticism of self. But our Rebbe repeated it by Fabrengen, because he felt that there's legitimacy to it. In other words, Chassidus is supposed to teach you something. You're not supposed in Yiddish, it works very well. Nicht nur lernen, nor ois lernen. Chassidus is not something you have to learn, but Chassidus you have to learn from. And what it is that you have to learn from Chassidus is how all of this study and all of this philosophy has to affect growth in terms of your being a human being. Having said that, let me give you the drama, the classic scenario. 2 types of Hasidim. They used to say in the olden days that they come from 2 cities, Klimovich and Neville, or Kremenchuk and Neville. Maybe you recognize these names, but these are different Hasidic communities, large, famous Chabad Hasidic communities, and they bred different types of Hasidim. Neville, the Shtetl Neville bred Oivdim, Hasidim who Maybe they weren't so smart, maybe they weren't so sophisticated, but they were intense. Klimovich and Kremenchuk had all the philosophers, all the thinkers, all the enlightened ones, And the most ideal Lubavitcher Hasidim had a problem with the philosophers, because it's not about the philosophy per se, it's about how the philosophy affects your practical life. So let me see if I can help you understand the difference between these two types. Let's start with the philosopher. A philosopher obviously has an appreciation for the abstract. Because the philosophy of Chabad Hasidus is not about what is a spoon feeling when you dip it in hot water and cold water. That's not what the philosophy of Chabad. The philosophy of Chabad is about Acharei HaTeva, what we call metaphysics. Things that by no means can be identified, directly or indirectly, using physical measure. They're totally spiritual. And as a result, your relationship to them is, in principle, indirect. You don't know what they are, but you just try to identify them by knowing what they must not be. And it takes a certain kind of person to appreciate that kind of philosophy. Some people find that very boring. Some people find that very enlightening, very intriguing, very challenging, and very, at the same time, very pristine, very pure, very removed from the filth and from the compromise and from the labor of everyday life. So Maskilim, Chabad Hasidim, whose strength was philosophy, studied lofty concepts, ideas like the Ein Sof, the spiritual worlds, and the higher and the more abstract and the less real, the better. Talk about, what is God, what is Ein Sof, what is Tzimtzum Rishon, what's before, what's after. I don't want to get into the names and the meanings behind these names because we don't have hours and hours and hours. But this is their pursuit. They want to understand godliness. They want to understand godliness because it enlightens them. They understand godliness is a certain richness in your mind. And they want to understand the more abstract, the higher levels of godliness. The Oivid, the second kind of Chabad Chassid, who's the worker, if you will, the Chassid whose entire focus is on self-improvement, he's not interested in lofty things for a very simple reason. It's irrelevant. What the Ein Sof is or isn't is not going to make me a better or a worse person. This level of Ein Sof, that level of Ein Sof that's revealed, Ein Sof that's hidden, Ein Sof that could be revealed but isn't revealed, Ein Sof that's absolutely not revealed, Ein Sof which is not even revealed. All these different levels and what they mean and what they represent and where they are on the map of, say, the Shtalshalos and how they have to do with Torah, mitzvahs. These are all mystical concepts, philosophical concepts. But if a person's focus is on their own self-improvement, their own work on themselves, when they study Hasidus, they study the most simple things. The simpler the better. To use the correct Hebrew, they're concerned with Mamalik Olam and Makad. They're interested in understanding God that they could relate to personally. Not the absolute truth of God and the transcendence of the Ein Sof, because they can't personalize those things. They cannot make those things affect them in their practical lives. So you have two Hasidim, both loyal to the traditions and to the culture of Hasidus Chabad. And certainly they're both loyal to their Rebbe, to their Holy Master, and to his teachings, and to his vision, and to his purpose, and to his end. And yet, they both come to the same city, study from the same Rebbe, and they're just completely interested in different things. They're focused, they're inspired by completely different things. One is moved and inspired by things that are lofty and enlightening, and the other is inspired by things that are very down to earth, very, very real and practical. I can use this to become a better person. I can use this to refine my character. I can use this to develop my mind. I can use this to become more disciplined. I can use this to be a more complete, a more whole, a more integrated servant of the Eibishter. So when these two people meet, it's I don't know if it's fire and kerosene or fire and water. It may just be they just cross each other's paths without even creating friction. It's totally different types of people. And there are many, many differences between these two types. They have always existed. In a way, they still exist today. There are many, many more people today who love to study philosophy of Chabad and love to do the avoid of Chabad. I can assure you of that. And add, unfortunately, because Hasidus is about self-improvement, it's not just about philosophy. But there's one fundamental difference in these two personalities. And that's the difference that's relevant for us tonight. And that is that when a person studies Hasidus Chabad as a philosophy, it doesn't really matter where he or she starts. It doesn't really matter. If you're studying philosophy of Hasidus and you want to understand it, study it. You want to learn about angels, learn about angels. You want to learn about souls, learn about souls. You want to learn about godliness, learn about godliness. You want to learn about before the first symptom, whatever you want to learn, it doesn't make a difference. Because it's ideas. The ideas are enlightening. And the word enlightening is really appropriate. And perhaps, if you learn enough and you're enlightened enough, it will actually refine you. There is that phenomena. A person studies philosophy enough that it raises them up, it makes them a better person. But it doesn't matter what they study. If I can digress for a moment, just to give you a parenthesis. In a week and a half, next Monday actually, I think, we're going to have the yahrzeit and the birthday of the Mittel Rebbe, second Lubavitcher Rebbe. And it also is joined by the day he was released from prison. There was a guy, a non-Jew, a philosopher, a professor, named Habenthal, who lived in Vitebsk, which is the nearest big city to Lubavitch. And he heard that the Mittel Rebbe could speak philosophy for 4 or 5 hours at a time, and hundreds of people listened to him with such enchantment that they're emotionless. And the idea that any human being can speak philosophy for 4 or 5 hours and have any audience intrigued him. Let alone to have hundreds of people who can stand for hours and just stay tuned in. He was blown away by the prospect. So he traveled to Lubavitch on a Shabbos afternoon. And in those days, outside the house, inside the house was almost equally quiet because there were no cars, So it was a hot summer day, so they took the platform outside into the yard, and the Rebbe was saying Chassidus on the yard, so he drove up with his wagon, and he stood and he watched. The Rebbe talked, and the Mittel Rebbe's Chassidus was not a piece of cake, it was philosophy, deep philosophy. He knew Yiddish, this guy, this Habenthal, and he also had some idea of Tanakh, he had some background in Tanakh, so he was able to follow a little bit what was going on. And he understood that whatever this rabbi was saying was quite intense. And it was incredibly impressive to him. He said a person puts his hand on his lip and it stays there for 2 hours. In other words, the concentration, not the Rebbe's concentration. The Hasidim, in other words, the Rebbe is a philosopher, okay, but that he had raised up so many Hasidim to such a level of intellectual interest impressed him. When the Rebbe was arrested, he came to Vitebsk as a witness, a character witness, and he said to the judge, he says, listen, I watched this man in action. No human being that could intellectually stimulate so many people the way he did could be a crook. He said it's impossible that a person who's so deeply steeped in ideas, philosophy alone, that not only is he a great philosopher, but he's had such an impact on his followers, it's impossible that such a human being should be involved in petty theft. It just cannot be. In other words, ideas can change a person, but it's a different kind of route, and it's really not a very reliable route. Because what happens in the brain doesn't usually have much of an effect on what happens in the heart. The Ovid, on the other hand, the laborer, the person who's focused on Hasidus, Chabad, and self-improvement, has a cardinal, unbreakable law. And that law is any person who wants to grow really has to start from the bottom. And any person who wants to grow really has to grow gradually and in order, one step at a time. You can't become a big tzaddik before you start being a glutton, just for example. It just doesn't work that way. You can't be in love with God until you deal with your tendency towards being a narcissist. There's an order, there's a plan, there's a program. And the Ovid has to start from the bottom. Why? Because his focus is on self-improvement. And the worst thing any person can do is work on self-improvement and be dishonest and lie to himself. And engaging in self-improvement and starting at the top of the mountain, starting at the top of the hill, it's an exercise in delusion. It's fantasy. It's no reality. If a person wants to grow, there's only one way to do it: step by step, gradualism, from the bottom to the top. So in the world of the Ovid, in the world of the Chassid, whose identity as a Chabad Chassid is measured not on how much philosophy he studied, but on how much he can work on himself and expect of himself and squeeze out of himself and grow. And of course all of us know there's only one real word that's relevant in growth, and that's consistency. So he knows I have to start with the basics. I have to start with my character first. I deal with my character, then I can start worrying about loving God. But you have to deal with your character first. To the maskil, to the philosopher, this is of much less consequence, because the philosopher is engaging in a philosophical pursuit. And whatever you study is enlightening. In fact, if you study more lofty things, in a way they have a greater impact. There's more enlightenment, there's more richness, there's more experience in studying lofty things. And then of course the question becomes, so what happens to you? And usually the answer is, I remain the same person I was before I started to study. But that's the philosopher's priority. In other words, all of us know that this week's Pasha Bashgacha Pratis is about Yaakov Avinu's ladder. Right? It just happens to work out very conveniently for us. Yaakov Avinu's ladder. And what does the pasuk describe it as? It's standing firmly on the ground and planted into the heavens. So in Hasidic writings, they make a prayer, they make a point. The only way that ladder could reach the heaven is if it starts on the ground. Artsa. So the previous Rebbe, the lowest level of artsias, the most base level of being a person. And when you climb a ladder, there are rungs. And God forbid you should skip a rung, or a rung should be missing. Because if you skip a rung, you fall, and you can get hurt. Depending how high you are, the harder you fall, the further you fall, the more destructive it is. You've got to be gradualistic. You have to be step by step. And to the Ovid, to the Chassid, whose life as a servant of God is defined by that gradual growth, his life is a ladder with a special priority, one step at a time. One step at a time you can reach the heavens. But you have to go one step at a time. Now just to enhance this concept a little bit further, the Zohar says, I want you to know that the dream of Yaakov Avinu is probably one of the most thoroughly explored and analyzed prophecies in all of Tanakh. Rambam writes, every little detail of this prophecy has a significance. Rambam writes, sometimes you have a prophecy and the basic point of the prophecy is significant, but the details don't matter. But this one, every little detail matters. This prophecy, every little nuance of the story is thoroughly analyzed and deeply explored and exposed and so forth. Says the Zohar, Sulam Dot Loisa. Dot Loisa. This ladder is prayer. The ladder that Yaakov Avinu is climbing in his dream, or that the angels are climbing in Yaakov Avinu's dream, is prayer. Because what prayer represents, and prayer means, as you'll hear it from here tonight with Hashem's help, prayer means personal growth. That's what it means. Prayer means a relationship with God that I define, and I create, and I fix. Mitzvahs, God commanded me. Torah, God enlightened me. Prayer, I connect. And the latter is the same notion as prayer, because the idea fundamentally is, I am growing. And for my growth to be real and useful and genuine and progressive, it has to be orderly. From the lowest madrega to the highest madrega. Let me give you an example. Not that important, but this is an example that I give. I am very uneducated. I'm not going to tell you to what degree I'm uneducated. That may frighten you out of the room, but trust me, I have very, very little formal secular education. But I found myself in a yeshiva once, as a teenager, where there was a group of us who, none of us were really learning a full regiment of secular subjects. They were teaching us English and math. And there was a whole group of kids who had to learn this English and math program. It was called, in our school, it was called Track A, as opposed to Track B. And I was the head of the group. I had some background. I knew how to read and write, and I knew some mathematics. So the teacher, his name was Mr. Walker, he was a nice guy. We weren't so nice to him, but he was a nice guy. Taught the whole class English and math, and he would tutor me privately. In other words, he somehow had to do double duty. We all sat in the same room. And of course, I was very conveniently a first-class pain in the neck, you know. I was ahead of the rest of the kids, so I made sure everybody knew what kind of genius I was. And he tried to teach me algebra. Now, any person who knows algebra understands that the magic of algebra is the miracle by which you figure out mysteries. Right? Algebra is a system of mathematics where you have variables, you have questions to which you don't have answers. It's mysterious, right? And just knowing the formula, knowing the rules of algebra works, you can resolve mysteries, you can answer questions not by figuring out the answers, but simply using mathematical formula, which is why any person who studied algebra knows that the teacher will always tell you, show your work. If you get a perfect score on an algebra test, but you don't show your work, you get a 0. Well, I was a smart guy. I was lazy to do the work. I mean, the algebra problems that I was learning were very basic, but I figured them out. In other words, I didn't go through the steps that you're supposed to go through. I just figured out what the variable were. We're dealing with 6 and 9 and 4. I could probably figure out what C was and what A was. What's the bottom line? I don't know algebra. That's the bottom line. I outsmarted myself because I was lazy to do the steps. Not understanding that it's all about the steps. What the teacher is teaching you is not how to answer questions, but how to learn how to solve problems. And when you cheat, because you're smart, who do you end up fooling? This is an experience that I had. That's a perfect example of this. A person whose Yiddishkeit is personal. Personal means I want to be a better person. I want to be closer to the Eibishter. And I want to go further away from being an animal. You've got to show your work. Not to anybody but to yourself. You have to take it step at a time. And if you don't, you're wasting your time and you can end up landing flat in your face. Which is why, as I explained to you before a little bit, in the Chabad culture, there was a huge movement of Hasidim whose definition was Chabad philosophers. And they were very intelligent people, and very schooled, and very sophisticated, and very knowledgeable, and they were not very well respected in the Chabad community. Because in the Chabad community there was a presumption that said, if you don't take this knowledge and use it to become a better person, you're wasting the knowledge. The Rabbi used to say, if you study Hasidus Chabad as a philosophy, you're not allowed to study it. It doesn't belong to you, you're a ganef. If you don't use it to improve yourself as a human being, you're not allowed to study. That's the way people felt. The Rabbi felt about Chabad Hasidus. Our Rabbi says, just study Hasidus. I don't care what your reason is, it'll help you. But in the olden times, when it was a better world, the purer world, the holier world, the more innocent world, the tradition was, if you don't use Hasidus to improve yourself as a human being, don't study it. This idea can be said in other words. The following, what I'm about to say, is not new to us. We had already in Tanya, chapter 27. It's come up repeatedly in the Tanya. And the other way of saying the same is iskafia. An unavoidable part of a successful life, and certainly an unavoidable part of a successful Jew, a successful chassid, is work. And work, by definition, means that it's uncomfortable. In the Chabad tradition, the word that is employed, that's originally from the Zohar, is skafia. Bend yourself. I had a neighbor of mine, he's since passed away, who was a very interesting fellow. And he went to see a chassid, Rabbi Sol Nevlet, who lived in a small little hut in Asia. And the apartment was half sunk into the ground, so the doorway was 5 feet tall. So if you're above 5 feet, you had to duck to get in. Now he wasn't paying attention, and he smashed his head. He smashed his head into the doorway as he was entering the apartment. And Rabbi Sol Nevlet tells him, "The vase favos is ungeklappt the cup." You know why you smashed your head? Weil du willst sich nicht beugen. Because you don't want to bend. And in Yiddishkeit, that bending is life itself. What is bending? Bending means a little bit of what I don't want. It doesn't have to be a lot. It has to be a little bit. But it has to be consistent. And the bending has to grow. Bend a little more. Bend a little more. And I'm not bending to suffer. I'm not bending to be miserable. I'm not bending so that I can say, oh, I'm religious, I punish myself. I'm bending because that is the tool. That is the medium by which I have a connection to the light, the enlightenment, the richness, in a real way. And the mashal for this, I've given you this mashal before, is a wick, a psila, a wick. How do you prepare a wick? I'm not in the wick business. You're not in the wick business for sure. You just graduated from the wick business. The way you prepare a wick is you take a piece of cotton and you spin it. No great science, I promise you. And after you spin the wick and you stretch it out, you take a match and you singe, you burn the tip, the edge of the wick. In Jewish law, that's called makabapatish. The wick is not complete until you burn the end of the wick. Who cares? What happens if the wick doesn't have a little singed, little black at the edge? What difference does it make? Now, technically, the answer is that little blackness at the tip of the wick is a place which is much easier to relight. It's a physical thing that an already burnt phenomena catches a better fire quicker than something that was never burned. When you light cotton, the great fear is that instead of burning, it'll just fizzle. Because the cotton is so combustible, it burns so easily that sometimes it just fizzes out. When you pre-light it and you create that little blackness, so you're going to get a much better fire, a much more secure fire, the fire will be prettier and it'll be more efficient and so on. So that black spot at the tip of the wick is the place where the fuel, the candle, meets the flame. So you have two things. You have a candle, and the candle is, of course, made of a vessel, a utensil, fuel, an oil of some sort, and a wick, and then fire. Fire represents everything that's spiritual. Fire that represents everything that's lofty. What is the point of meeting between fire, between spirituality, and a person where it's black? And in terms of ourselves, that's the place where we are bending ourselves, where we are telling ourselves no, where we are disciplining ourselves, we are making ourselves responsible. And in this particular context, we mean in Avodas Hashem, not so I should lose weight, or that I should be more fit, or that I should have a better heart rate, but that I should be a better person, I should be a better Jew. I am bending myself so I can be a better Jew. And in life, and in real Avodas Hashem, al derech HaChasidus, everything comes down to that point. Everything comes down to that little spot where the fire meets the blackness of the wick. In other words, what I do to make the light and beauty of Hasidus useful, productive, and growth-oriented is I bend myself. And that bending of self, this is my work on me, and that bending of self, which is my work on me, is my ladder that I climb emphatically, dafke, gradually, one step at a time. And there's an order, there's a proceeding, there's a process. First there's skafia, first there's the bending, and only afterwards can be the growth. Now that I've given you the introduction, let's tie this into tshuva. We've been learning about tshuva for weeks. The last 2 weeks, we actually discussed tshuva itself. 2 classes ago, we talked about the lower tshuva. And really, in its essence, the lower tshuva is a bitterness. The lower tshuva is a self-directed anger, self-directed frustration, of failure. And of course, along with the bitterness of failure, there's also the asking God to have mercy, and God to shine a light to heal us. But the lower tshuva is, however you beautify it, it's painful. The lower tshuva is the purging of self. The only good news about purging self is that it's always easy to purge yourself than have somebody else purge you for you. Everybody knows that from experience, right? The only thing worse would be than beating up on yourself and have somebody else beat you up. That's just the way it goes. Then there's the higher tshuva. The higher tshuva has nothing to do with sin. The higher tshuva is about meeting God consciously. The higher tshuva is about being re-enlightened. The higher tshuva in the language of the Tanya is dapkas rucha berucha. My spirit should join, should fuse with the spirit of God. In other words, I should consciously feel Hashem. I should feel good about God, because God is in my life, not just on a level of faith, not just on a level of practice, but on a level of real experience. Now, what does it mean to feel God? Feel God is a very high level. But to feel positively about godliness is a very, very realistic level. And it has to do with being tuned in. How does a person feel good about God if they're paying attention? And they're consistent. You can't feel good about God if you're religious on the weekends. You can't feel good about God if you're religious Mondays, Tuesdays, and Thursdays. You can only feel good about God if you're constant. Why? Because if you are inconsistent, if you're irregular in your avodah, the days that you're off, you're contaminating yourself. You're making yourself dirty. You're making yourself unclean. That's darkness. It pushes the possibility of the enlightenment. It pushes the possibility of the richness of godliness away. People who are very materialistic don't know why they're not able to feel spirituality. Because materialism and spirituality are enemies. People who give in to themselves, people who are weak, people who forgive themselves all the time for the mistakes that they make, don't understand why they're not sensitive to spirituality. And the answer, of course, is because spirituality is very spiritual, but it needs a candle. There is a an appropriate conduit, that is a suited, a properly prepared medium for that spirituality. And that medium is the blackness at the tip of the wick, which is the lower tshuva. So the language of the Iggeres Hateshuva, instead of talking about a skafia and avoida that said in my introduction, the Alter Rebbe makes a point in chapter 10 of Iggeres Hateshuva which is critical. And the critical point is you cannot do the higher tshuva without first doing the lesser tshuva. Period, the end, full stop. There's an order to things. The lower tshuva is painful. The higher tshuva is beautiful. What is the higher tshuva? Not I did anything wrong. I'm walking into godliness. I'm going to think about God so much that I'm going to have good feelings towards Him. I'm going to feel close to Him. Those feelings of closeness are the higher tshuva. I'm going to study Torah and I'm going to enjoy the Torah. I'm going to be enlightened by the Torah. That enlightenment is my walking into God, is my returning to God, is my being close to God. That's the higher tshuva. But, argues the Alter Rebbe, there's a fundamental rule. And that is, in order for the spirituality and the enlightenment, which is the higher tshuva, to reach us, it must follow the lower tshuva. And the argument in principle is that when one skips the lower tshuva and goes straight to the higher tshuva, it's like climbing a ladder trying to skip rungs. You don't even have anything. You don't have the higher tshuva, certainly not, and you don't even have the lesser tshuva, because you've got to go through the steps. So in chapter 10 of Iggeres Hateshuva, the Alter Rebbe discusses the challenges of this. And he says as follows: as a practical matter, this proposal, this argument that we just put forth, that the two dimensions of tshuva, the first dimension of tshuva is a bitter dimension of tshuva. It's a directed inward negativity about weakness, about failure, about inconsistency. And it's frustrating, it's painful, and it's negative, and it's a cleansing process. And the higher concept of tshuva, which is to put myself in a place of light, to put myself in an environment of a sense of holiness and closeness to God, have to happen in that order. Now, many a person would love to do tshuva as long as they can skip the frustration. Because it's fundamentally un-American to feel bad for yourself. We're all wonderful. Life is a party. Right? As my teenagers say, it's all good. And every time they say it, they get my inside of my skull is crawling. I think it's just so shallow. It's so escapist. But okay, that's just me. If a person could do the higher tshuva and not do the lower tshuva, it would be wonderful. Just be enlightened. So the Alter Rebbe doesn't work that way. It doesn't work that way because in order for your spirituality to be real, in order for your spirituality to be grounded, in order for your spirituality to raise you up, you need a pure candle. And the purity of the candle is the lower tshuva. And the Alter Rebbe quotes two Gemaras to corroborate this. There's two Talmudic statements. One is in the Mishnah, and one is in the Gemara that follows it. Listen to this. Ein oimdim lehispalel ella mitoich kavod rosh. One cannot begin to pray unless they have kavod rosh. Kavod rosh means a heavy head. And it's translated, and it's actually hachna v'shiflos. Before you can pray, you have to be broken. Humble. You have to have a sense of humility and lowliness. In other words, a sense of brokenness. Says the Talmud, Ein oimdim lehispalel ella mitoich simcha. One cannot begin to pray unless they're in a joyous condition. Can you have a greater contradiction than that? The same Chazal tell us, if you want to pray properly, you have to break yourself. Same Chazal tell us, if you want to pray properly, you have to be joyous. No, what's the answer to the question? The answer to the question is, different times. The beginning of the prayer is a brokenness, no doubt about it. In the Maimonic Hasidus that are more involved, they're called Shikhiya Mechabeis Avich. You have to divorce, material parts of yourself to be able to daven. You have to forget it, and that forgetting is a purging process, is a cleansing process, which is quite bitter. But then you're not ready to daven yet, because if you walk with the shoulder pressed, there's nothing that frightens away God more than people in bad moods. I mean, maybe people with big egos frightens God away also, but depression is ego. So before you pray, you have to have joy. So Alter Rebbe says like this: once upon a time, people were much more in touch with themselves and much more in touch with their emotions. And they were realistically, in other words, practically in a position to turn off one emotion and to turn on another. So they started their prayer in the morning. They came to shul. They focused on what's not good, needs to be better. They were bitter. They were broken. They were humbled by it. Then they turned the humility off and turned the joy on. And then they davened. Alter Rebbe says, chances are it's not going to happen to us. Either we'll be stuck with the brokenness, or the brokenness will not happen because we'll be so busy with the joy. And therefore, Alter Rebbe says, we need to do it at separate times. In other words, if we are serious about Yiddishkeit, and this is not just a philosophy, it's a practical way of life. And in this particular scheme, we're not just talking about the way of life in terms of service of God. We're talking about the way of life in service of God in as much as tshuva is concerned. I did something wrong, and A, I want to fix it, and B, I want to turn to the graces of God. In other words, A, I want to go away from what's bad, and B, I want to go back to what's good. That's the lower tshuva and the higher tshuva. And everybody knows they have to do it in 2 steps, so Alter Rebbe do them separately. And he says the time for the lower tshuva is at midnight. Tikkun Chatzos. There may be people in this room who don't even know that there's a Jewish tradition that at midnight you're supposed to pray. We know about 3 times a day, yeah? Then we know before you go to sleep you're supposed to say Shema. But in the Gemara, and in the Chazal, and the Shulchan Aruch, there was a prayer that was done at midnight. Once upon a time they would actually get together in shul with a minyan to daven at midnight. And then it would keep done at home, and now there's like a handful of people on the planet who still pray. The prayer that one does at midnight is mourning for the destruction of the temple. Tikkun Chatzos. It's a very painful prayer. It's like a nightly Tisha B'Av. It's a lamentation, it's a mourning for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And nowadays it's only done by the biggest tzaddikim. Says Alter Rebbe, that's the time for the lower tshuva. The lower tshuva is done hours and hours now before you pray. It's midnight, it's dark. Darkness is, of course, a symbol. It represents the concealment of the presence of God Almighty. This is the time for the bitterness about tshuva, the bitterness for my sins, the bitterness for my weakness, my failure, my inconsistency, and so forth. In the morning, hours and hours later, when you actually get up to daven, now approach the prayer with joy. And now the Alter Rebbe goes on and says, no, who's getting up every night at midnight to pray? Not many people. He says, okay, do it once a week. Just once a week. Once a week, Thursday night, he says, do this Tikkun Chatzos. And he connects it to Shabbos. Shabbos is Oisius Toshev. Shabbos is the same letter as the word Teshuva. But Shabbos itself is positive. In order to have the positive tshuva, the higher tshuva on Shabbos, you have to first do the lower tshuva before Shabbos. And the designated time in terms of the week to do the lower tshuva as a means of preparing oneself for the higher tshuva of Shabbos itself is Thursday night. Now, although what I'm about to say is not written in the Tanya, but this is the way it was taught to me by Mashpiyim, we don't get up in the middle of the night and mourn for the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. We're simply not holy enough. But we say Shema before we go to bed. And the Shema we recite before we go to bed serves a similar purpose. In the nightly Shema, we do tshuva. We say Lamtzech B'voy, we say that psalm that King David said when he himself was doing tshuva for his own sin. We confess, we say vidoy, we say all kinds of things that are about focusing on things we've done during the course of that day that are not appropriate and healing them. So, for those of us who are not getting up at midnight once a week or every night to mourn for the destruction of the temple, the time to do the lower tshuva before you go to bed at night. And the idea is that if you're going to serve Hashem properly, you have to have a time for bitterness and frustration, and then you have to have a time for joy. The davening is a time of joy. Why is davening a time of joy? Because davening is about meeting God. The time of bitterness and frustration is about singeing the wick. It's about blackening the tip. It's about bending ourselves. It's about the lower tshuva. The davening itself is already a process of going into the light. So davening, as a part of enlightenment, as a part of a spiritual pursuit, is positive. So at midnight, you do tshuva, or at night, you do tshuva. In the morning, when you get up to pray, you have to pray with joy. But the Alter Rebbe gets much more involved in this discussion than this. And let me explain it to you in this way. You have to understand, whether you do or you don't, you have to understand that Judaism teaches that if you serve God, you're connected to God, period. If you put on tefillin, you're connected to God. If you keep shol kosher, you're connected to God. If you do what you're supposed to in all areas of life, you're connected to God. The word mitzvah, as all of us know, means connection. A person does mitzvahs, they're connected to God Almighty. Rabbi says in the first book of Tanya something incredibly radical. He says when a person is doing a mitzvah, he's holding God. Although the Zohar says, Leis machshavat fisa beklal, God cannot be grasped, God cannot be touched, God cannot be reached at all. When you're doing a mitzvah, you're holding God. What's the problem? You don't feel it. You put on film, what happens? Nothing happens. You put up a mezuzah, what happens? Almost nothing happens. I don't want to start up with it. We do mitzvahs. We believe that we're doing mitzvahs. We're connected to God. Conscious connection to God doesn't happen because you do a ritual. Conscious connection to God happens if you pay attention. And therefore, when we are speaking about the higher truth, and we are making the case, as the case is, that the higher truth is not about sin and it's not about negativity, it is simply about returning to spirituality, it's returning to a conscious and felt relationship with Hashem. So step one is, you cannot do the higher tshuva without doing the lower tshuva. The bitterness, the cleansing of self must come first. And step two is the higher tshuva is not just study Torah and do mitzvahs. The higher tshuva is study Torah and do mitzvahs and feel. And to this end, the Alter Rebbe adds something very important. Before you study Torah, before you do mitzvahs, pray. If a person davens, and after he davens he studies Torah, and after he davens he does mitzvahs, then in his davening and in his Torah and in his mitzvahs, he won't only be connected to God because that's what it says in the holy books, and he believes the holy books, but there will be a conscious experience. Because davening is called in the Gemara avodah shabalev. Davening is called in the Torah, and the Rambam brings it to halacha, the labor of the heart. How do you put on tefillin? With your hands. How do you build a sukkah? With your hands. How do you pray? Not with your mouth. Mistake. With your heart. Yeah, we say the words. But which organ, which limb in the body is designated for prayer? The heart. In other words, if a person prays and doesn't use their heart, how do we say this gently? They're not praying. They're reading siddur. Praying is emotional. Praying is avodah shabalev, the Gemara calls it, naloch is. It's a spiritual thing. It's about the heart. In other words, prayer is about a personal relationship with a personal God. That's what it's about. Mitzvahs, God made the rules, we follow. Torah, God wrote the books and we read. Prayer, I don't mean this, but I do mean it. We write our own prayer book. Now everybody knows there's a printed prayer book with so many pages and it's translated into English, and how do I have to read so much every day and the same words over and over again? If a person, I once gave a class that was called Developing a Relationship with God. Don't let the prayer book be an obstacle between you and your Creator. For many people, the biggest obstacle towards prayer is the prayer book. Why? I have to read all these words. I'm so busy reading words. Who has time to think? Who has time to concentrate? Who has time to be personal with the Eibishter? Big mistake. You have to find time. You have to make time. Stop reading. Think. Talk to the Eibishter in your own language. It's not something novel that I'm telling you. It's a basic mistake about what prayer means. In other words, the way we pray is not correct with a problem. It's wrong. Prayer is not reading a prayer book. There's many good reasons why we have to read a prayer book. And we're not about to dispose of it. They knew what they were doing. But the siddur was made to enhance avodah shabalev, to enhance our possibilities of spiritually tuning into God, not to complicate it. And if we feel the prayer book complicates it, we need lessons in prayer. Not lessons in what the meaning of the words are, but lessons in the idea of personalizing God. There's specific points in the text that people are told, this is the time to stop and think. Talk to God in English here. But prayer means connection. Tefillah means connection, not just... The technical definition of prayer, the nigel definition of prayer, is asking God for our needs. The spiritual, the more meaningful definition of prayer is to connect to God consciously. So, when we talk about the higher tshuva, and the higher tshuva has nothing to do with sin, the higher tshuva is about meeting God, the higher tshuva is about consciously and emotionally and spiritually tuning in to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. There are a few rules. Rule number one, you have to do the lower tshuva first. And the lower tshuva is the bitterness, the cleansing of what's negative. Rule number 2, you have to stop doing a tshuva, which means you have to do it at a separate time. Rule number 3, you have to begin the higher tshuva, not with Torah study, not with mitzvahs, with prayer. Because davening by definition is avodah shabalev. Davening by definition is the emotional time. And the Alter Rebbe is quite concise in this chapter. He's not very, very elaborate. But in Hasidic discourses, there is so much discussion on this topic. And what they do is that they explain the Siddur as being a ladder. I mentioned to you a while back what the Zohar says about this week's Parsha, Sulam Dot Sloisa, the ladder in Yankov Avinu's dream is the ladder of prayer, which means to say that davening has steps. In other words, the prayer book is divided up into sections. And when you look in Kabbalah's Sfarim that explain the prayer book, they correspond to the world. Asiya, Yetzira, Bria, Tzilas. There's a process, there's a gradualism. And the steps are basically as follows. And I want to make a disclaimer. Not everything I'm going to say now was written in this Pedic in Tanya. But nothing I'm going to say now I invented. I'm not that smart. It's my Mori Hasidus. Because the Tanya here is very, very concise, or at least quite concise. So I'm elaborating a little bit. In general, the prayer, the Siddur, is broken up into 4 parts. The first step of prayer is called Hoida'ah, submission. Submission means, God, I'm not a smart aleck. I accept. Moida ani lefanecha is translated in English as I thank. It's such a poor translation. Moida does not mean I thank. Moida means I submit. Submit means I give myself to you. I'm laying in bed. I haven't brushed my teeth yet. My hands are unclean. I'm not even saying God's name, but I say, God, you're it. I believe in you. I don't know why, but I accept. I submit. That's moida ani lefanecha. The first dimension of prayer is submission, is our acceptance. Or to say it in other words, our bringing out the idea that our relationship to God is based first and foremost on faith. That's step 1. Step 2 is what we call the Psukei de Zimra, the songs of praise. Psukei de Zimra begins with Baruch Sha'amar until Yishtabach. I don't have a siddur, I can't tell you the page numbers, but you can find it very easily. The basic definition of this section of the prayer is called Sipur Shmochav Shalmokim, which translates practically as you sit with a prayer book and you tell God how much you love Him, because you're really telling God how much you love yourself. Why do I love God? Because He feeds me. Why do I love God? The Giants won. That's why I love God. Why do I love God? Because He provides for me. He protects me. He preserves me. He picks me up. You say basically, I love God because God is good to me. But good to me on what level? On an animal emotional level. On a level which is really ultimately a selfish level. It's not sophisticated, it's not enlightened, it's not spiritual. It's very down to earth. The Psukei de Zimra are all about the passage which lies at its heart. You open up your hand. And you sate, you satisfied all living things. Ratzain, what they want. That's the heart of Psukei de Zimra. So you're going from a stage of submission, of accepting God, to what's called in Hasidus an emotional stage. You get excited about the Eibishter. Why do I like God? Because God takes care of me. Not because God is the truth, not because I'm interested in the truth, but because I like myself, and the Eibishter takes care of me, so I like Him. Just like if someone took care of your children, you'd like them. Because you like your kids, and if you like people who take care of your kids, you like the Eibishter, He takes care of us. The third rung of the prayer is much more involved. It's called basically the intellectual rung, where you're philosophizing about God. And in this stage of the prayer, which is of course the Birchas Krishma and the Krishma, the blessings of the Shema and the Shema, you are now not simply permitting yourself to develop a relationship with God that's emotional, that's based on what I personally stand to gain or do gain on a material level, but based on the ideal truth of God. And you begin with a discussion of the angels. Right? The first bracha of Birchas Krishma, we're talking about how the angels pray. The reason we begin with the discussion of the angels is because obviously angels are a lot closer to God than we are. An angel's relationship to God is not based on the fact that he helped them win a bet or something exciting like that. Angels are closer to God because angels are deep. They're lofty beings who the whole identity is spirituality, and in their spiritual realm and in their spiritual world, they have a sense of value to the relationship that they maintain with their Creator. And therefore they say, Kadosh, 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 holy, holy, holy. Blessed be the glory of His name, the glory of God, Mimkaimer, wherever He is. And we talk about the angels because that's stepping away from a prayer which is entirely materially self-centered, and we're moving towards a level where we're relating to God in a much more sophisticated way as angels attempt to relate to God. And after we talk about angels, we talk about souls. After we talk about angels, we talk about souls. That means us. In the belief that Jewish souls, human souls, are higher than angels. The second bracha of Kishma, Ava Selam Aftanu, Ava Selam Beis Yisrael, Ava Rabba. The long version for why this is, in other words, why would we argue that human beings, Jewish souls, are higher than angels when it certainly doesn't seem that way, is a very, very involved discussion. But let me just suffice to say this, that angels as a rule are emotional beings. Souls have the capacity for intellect, for ideas. In other words, they don't only use their mind as a means of arousing their heart and their soul. They use their mind to understand truth. And therefore, after you discuss the angel's relationship with God, you go on to a higher level and talk about human beings' relationship with God. That's the second blessing of the Shema. We're not talking about in Maida, we talk about the stars and the constellations, because the stars and the constellations are the embodiment of the angels, as it's discussed in the holy books. The second bracha of Krishma is Avas Elam Amcha Hofta Beis Yisrael, Jewish people. Then you get to the Shema itself. What happens when you get to the Shema itself? Shema Yisrael, Hashem Alekeinu, Hashem Echad. Now you're talking about God, period. Not about angels' relationship with God, not about souls' relationship with God, the truth of God. This is the highest intellectual point in the davening. But remember, there's an order, and there's a gradualism. And what's the cardinal rule? You've got to go in order. The effectiveness of prayer is only if we were able to submit. Number one, we accept. Number two, we get excited emotionally on a selfish level. Only number three is, now let's try and understand what angels are doing in their relationship with God, what souls are doing in relationship with God, and then the truth of God alone. The final step of this process, and of course the Alter Rebbe here in this Pedic says, if you are going to love love God with all your life, all your soul, which was interpreted in the previous chapter. I love God so much that the love is not in my heart, it's in my arms and my legs. My whole body instinctively is doing God's will because I'm so emotionally involved with God that my body is doing the mitzvahs that Hashem commands me to do based on the experience that I'm having in my heart. That process is effective only if you go through all the steps. And if a person sort of slept his way through Maidani and Baruch Shomar and he woke up in the middle of Krishma, he's got a problem. More than one. The Shmoyne Esrei, the Amida, when you put your feet together and you stand in front of God, this is the highest point in the davening. As is demonstrated by the introductory passage. How does Shmoyne Esrei begin? Hashem, Kama, my God, Sefosai Tiftach, open my lips, Upi Yaget Yosecha, so that my mouth can speak your praises. So it says in all this Svarim, what does this mean? You're about to pray and you're asking God to pray for you? And the answer is that there's a presumption. When you stand in front of God, you're speechless. You can't even speak. And you're asking Hashem, please help me pray. In other words, the progression of this ladder culminates where a person stands and imagines that Hashem is standing opposite him. As I've explained this to you so many times, the whole design of the prayer is to create a space where God is in our own imagination. Where I'm going to stand, God's in front of me. Where you're standing, God's in front of you. It doesn't mean that there's 2 gods or 10 gods. Everybody has to personalize God's spatially, so we should be able to have a spatial context. Not because God needs a spatial context. And God's opposite you. And you step back so that you can approach Him. You approach God and you bow before Him. And the whole mindset of the Shemona Esrei is right now, and when I stand in front of God, I'm putting away my interests, my will, my ego completely. All there is God. But you see, it's easy to say. Very easy to say. Incredibly meaningful to do. And the key to success in doing it is these steps that we've just indicated. The gradualism, the step-by-stepism, which begins with the Kishma Shalamito or the Tikchas, the Kevid Rosh, the bitterness of the lower tshuva, which sets the stage for the richness and the enlightenment of the higher tshuva. And then the Alter Rebbe says, if you get up in your morning and you daven, when you do a mitzvah later, and you study Torah afterwards, and understand this, we believe that when you're doing a mitzvah, you're one with God. When you study Torah, you're bringing the light of the Ein Sof into your personality. Who feels that? And the answer to that question is, did you daven? Did you pray? In other words, the ability or the value of learning Torah, which is Tshuva Allah, the higher Tshuva is Torah. Why? Torah is Ein Sof. Torah is not just God's wisdom. Torah is God's light. When I study the Torah, I am being enlightened by God. How does it feel? It feels like nothing for most people most of the time. Why? Because we're forgetting this criteria, this policy, this law that says, if you want a real experience in your relationship with the Eibishter, you're going to have to put in real work. And real work doesn't mean I'm sincere, as they say in Hippieville. I mean it. Step gradualism. And that's what chapter 10 drives home as a culmination, as a continuing of what we learned last week in chapter 7, 8, 9, and 9, the last two classes that we had. Understand that there's an order to tshuva. The lower tshuva must come first, because the lower tshuva refines us. Then the higher tshuva has steps. And the beginning of those steps is davening. Of all the branches of our religion, right? And the Mishnah says Torah has 3 pillars. Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chasadim. Torah study, mitzvahs, and prayer. The one that is most personal, the one that is most about us, and the least about God, is prayer. And it becomes the critical link between ourselves and our capacity not to have a relationship with God, but to have a relationship with God which we're able to feel. And this is what real people are after. Or if I may say so, what real Hasidim wanted. They wanted a connection with Atmas himself. The Alter Rebbe had a chassid, his name is Aaron Strasheller. He was a very, very great man. He was 14 or 16 years old, he was very young. He came to the Alter Rebbe for the first time, and he went into Iggeres, went to a private audience with a little note, as was the tradition. And in the note he wrote, quote, "Hanefesh hashvela be'emes, if one's soul is truly lowly, keitzad yiskarev al Ein Sof, how can he approach the Ein Sof?" In other words, I want to feel God. I want to feel close to the Eibishter. Alter Rebbe got so excited. Alter Rebbe was so moved. He ran out of the room and left the poor guy standing there. He went into the next room, and there were a bunch of chassidim sitting and learning. And he holding the paper in his hand, and he says, "Look, a little boy came to me and asked me a question that not one of you even bothered asking. And that's how do you get close to the Eibishter? And the answer is, there's a ladder, there's steps. And as a practical matter, the beginning of the higher tshuva, in other words, the beginning of the tshuva which is not about sin, the beginning of the tshuva which is about feeling close to the Eibishter, is davening. And the steps of davening. And it opens us up, it puts us in a space where we could eventually feel not only the scholarship, the intellect of the Torah, but the godliness of the Torah, the holiness, the spirituality in the Torah. And when you do a mitzvah, it's not just a ritual that you're doing in faith alone, but a ritual that you're doing that has great meaning, spiritual meaning, personal meaning. Okay? And before we go, let me just say something to you. We're going to be having another class, next Monday, with the help of God, where we're going to be learning much, much more about the joy aspect of tshuva, the happiness that's involved in the process of doing tshuva. I just want you to know now that tonight's class made a very clear point that you can't skip steps. Well, our Rebbe advocates doing exactly that, starting your life with the higher tshuva. But we'll get to it. Tonight's class, I emphatically didn't include that in the discussion. We're going to say that for later classes. Tonight I wanted to share with you, this is Tanya chapter, Iggeres Hateshuva chapter 10. That's what it is. It's an important perek. It's a short perek, but the message is very important. If you're serious about business, if you're serious about a connection to the Eibishter, davening is the key, and order is the key, and consistency is the key.